Thirdly then, now, what happens next in the Church of England? Well, dioceses are now debating the legislation. Between now and November 2011, all 44 diocesan synods will debate and vote on whether to accept it. They can only accept or reject the legislation. They cannot amend it. PCCs and deaneries may debate and vote, but in the legislative process, only the voting of diocesan synods counts. Voting at PCC and deanery level advises diocesan synods of the general opinion of the people in the diocese. Diocesan synods, after voting on the legislation as it stands, they can then put forth amendments, what are called a following motion. And they could, in those following motions, recommend certain things, such as this synod asks for further provision for those opposed, or, quote, this synod urges General Synod to appoint women as bishops on exactly the same basis as men, or whatever. But it's called a following motion. Provided more than half the diocese approve the legislation, the House of Bishops then has final scrutiny of the legislation. The legislation could be amended at this stage, but this would be highly unusual and would probably happen only if the great majority of dioceses wanted the legislation to be altered, and this would have to be stated in the following motions, as I call it. If the legislation was amended, General Synod would then have to vote on it again, and if the amended legislation was rejected, the whole legislative process would have to begin again. There follows then, after the House of Bishops has scrutiny, a final debate and a vote in General Synod. And presently, this is planned for July 2012. The final approval requires a 2/3 vote in favor in each of the three houses, the bishops, the clergy, and the laity. This ensures that the legislation is well supported across the church by requiring a 2/3 vote. Parliament then considers and approves the legislation, and royal assent follows. Final legal processes and the appointments process means that if all is approved as is, the first women may be appointed as bishops in around 2014. Now, before I end, it's important to comment on two aspects of the present legislation. Part of the opposition to the legislation as it stands is that it is perceived and felt to not give in law enough protection for those opposed to the ordination of women as priests and the consecration of women to the episcopate. Now, it's important to understand, firstly, the legislation as it stands, in order to accommodate those who conscientiously oppose the measure, the present legislation does oblige every diocesan bishop to make a scheme in consultation with the diocesan synod for delegating the exercise of episcopal ministry relating to the celebration of the sacraments and pastoral care to a male bishop. In addition, by clause, it entitles a parish to issue what's called a letter of request to the diocesan bishop to seek the ministry of a male bishop, and in a vacancy, that only a male priest is appointed. In respect of this provision, the legislation requires that the Church of England request exemption from the Equality Act of 2010, so that these parishes, which have a letter of request and the like, can legally contravene that act. Secondly, the legislation also requires the House of Bishops to draw up a code of practice, which must be approved by General Synod to give guidance on matters of practice under the measure, to which anyone exercising functions in the Church of England must have regard. And so this code of practice will, as supposedly practically, give instructions for how the scheme that each diocese is meant to set up, each diocesan bishop is meant to set up, perhaps should be done, as well as other suggestions for how the legislation should be implemented. The code of practice does not have the same force as a measure. It is, however, more than mere guidelines, and in previous precedents in ecclesiastical law, a code of practice has been interpreted as having the same obligation as a law within the Church. However, those, especially from the Catholic Anglican perspective, believe a code of practice is not sufficient legal protection. A draft code of practice is presently being drawn up to enable those opposed to consider the Church's commitment to due care for those opposed, and it will be presented when the legislation comes to General Synod for final approval. Well, to conclude, whatever our position on women bishops, we are brothers and sisters in Christ. The matter of women bishops is contentious and divisive for significant theological and ecclesiological issues. But it's not the essence of our faith. No matter your position on women bishops, we all together can affirm the apostolic and Nicene creeds. As we debate and decide, we must all act in Christian charity and mutuality, avoiding slanders, insults, and false accusations. Our witness to the world will not primarily be what we decide on this issue, but how we decide and how we treat one another and whom we disagree. Thank you very much for your attention.